Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the third in our series of webinars. My name is Richard Tones. I'm the Sales and Marketing Executive for AfriSam. And we have with us this morning Karen Doubell. I'll introduce her in a moment. But just to give everyone a perspective on what we're trying to achieve with these webinars, as we indicated up front, that given where our country currently finds itself as a result of this pandemic, there are lots of people doing various things to enable people to survive this pandemic. We see people handing out food parcels and lots of initiatives that companies are doing. But as AfriSam, we thought that it might be necessary to help people with understanding the economy, navigating their way through their financial difficulties. And this morning, we're focusing specifically on leadership, managing in a crisis. And I want to start off by introducing today's speaker. Her name is Karen Doubell, as I indicated. I'm just trying to get her profile up quickly. So Karen is an executive coach. She started her career, interestingly, in law, and then ventured off and did clinical psychology at UCT Business School. She qualified as an executive coach. And Karen works mainly with executives in the financial sector. We're very privileged that she has done some work with our organization as AfriSam. And I think she will touch on some of that in the case study during her presentation. Karen, we're very privileged to have you online with us today. We trust that the audience will gain as much insights as we have from your coaching and the work that you've done with us. So yeah, over to you, Karen. And for those of you who are online, you can ask questions whilst Karen is busy presenting. I will capture the questions on the side and then we will engage with you. We also have a poll survey which Karen will run during the presentation. So please participate in the poll survey. There is maybe one or two questions where you might be required to just click on and answer the questions. But yeah, please feel free to ask whatever questions you have, and we will deal with those. I think Karen will be presenting for about a half an hour or so, and then we will engage with you and respond to all your questions. I'm going to switch on to the slideshow now.
Thank you, Richard. We'll wait for the slideshow. I'm not sure what's there, but in the meantime, just to say, yeah, greetings to all people that might be online that I have met and worked with at AfriSam, and I send you warm greetings. And for those that I haven't met before, just a warm welcome. As Richard said, my name's Karen, and yeah, I really am quite privileged to be invited to be here speaking with you all today and giving you some insights and some perspectives. In my world of leadership and complexity theory, there is so much on the go at the moment. So sifting through and trying to find some nuggets to share with you that I feel could be possibly useful in this time of crisis. It has not been easy, actually, and I'm sure you've also all been inundated with variety of information, and there's so many opinions and polls and stats and things out there. So how do we make sense of this was really the point that I came from. We are in crisis, and the role of leaders is in crisis as well. So in coming up with the title of this presentation, Leadership in Crisis, Responding with Coherence to the Current and Future Challenges, was very specific languaging that I looked at and chose for you. So I invite you for this next 30 to 40 minutes to really pause and declutter your mind of all the stresses, anxieties, tasks, burdens, worries that are sitting with us all at the moment, and just to try and declutter and give yourself the gift of just breathing and thinking of you and your role and your self-care and what it means for you to lead yourself first and foremost, and to be there for others and the business in this crisis moment. So that's my invitation to you, that you've signed up for this webinar, you're here now, and really give yourself the opportunity to think of you and possibly journal some notes or some reflection time for yourself. So that's my hope. Where were you at, Happy New Year of 2020? If I think back, I could not have ever imagined that now in June, halfway through 2020, when we celebrated New Year and the start of the new decade, 2020 decade, that I would ever have believed that we're sitting in this situation now. So if you just think back and cast your mind to where were you, our 2010 decade was filled with disruption. It started with the global financial crisis, 2010. There's global warming. There was smartphone, the iCloud, variety of issues and dilemmas in the construction industry, definitely. I know that you've had previous speakers speaking about the economy and analysts. And yeah, not all good news. I also was privileged to be at AfriSam's breakfast earlier this year. We're really taking a deep dive into what this means. How do we plan forward? Possibly many of you as leaders had also strategized for this year, had spent time at the end of 2019 looking at what are the strategies, what are the plans, what are we going to achieve this year, and how that has changed. Yeah, the word unprecedented change has been used and bandied around a lot. So what does that mean? It's that change that nobody anticipated. And the Hay Global Group spoke and actually published a fantastic article at the end of 2019. Now, I've quoted there a little bit that the last decade has taught us anything, that is that we can't predict the future. No one can. And yet I don't even think that anybody could have predicted where we are now. Alvin Toffler, my other quote on this slide, he's an incredible writer and futurist, actually, and speaks about different ages and different times that we have been going through as leaders and as business individuals and as human beings, actually. And he speaks about our IT age as the great growing engine of change and how we are in this global age at the moment. Some of you may have heard of the term the fourth industrial revolution, which is that next step. And yet we find ourselves in crisis now. Is the fourth industrial revolution really what people like Alvin Toffler and futurists expected and predicted it to be? Yeah, not so sure. We're sitting with many unknowns and a huge age of uncertainty, actually. So what I'm hoping to bring you is some leadership insight. And so what does all of this mean for us as leaders? What should we be focusing on? What can we be focusing on? We have this microorganism that some people have described has brought a war on the world. And what does that mean for us? How have we been coping? Where we've been focusing? What insights personally and for business has that brought? I spoke about complexity theory just now, and there's absolute, I suppose, agreement that we cannot forge forward in any linear way. We are in this entangled environment that requires disentanglement. So what does that mean for us? We are being bombarded with so much at such a pace of this rapid complexity. There's a new word called replexity that's been going around in the leadership world. What is this replexity, and how do we maintain some consciousness and some insight as leaders to really take forward our businesses, to make the steps that really care and look after our people that rely on us? So in a recent Harvard Business Review article, there was the very positive quote that says, or question actually, that reads, is there a silver lining to our current business environment? And Richard spoke about a poll, and I'd like to just get a sense of the audience and who's here and what your sense of this is. So I'm going to put up the poll now. Their view in the Harvard Business Review is that leadership skills that we're building now, the new way that we're needing to work, the new way of thinking, is really going to serve us far beyond COVID-19. It's a time of change, time of renewal. I'd like to get your views, though. How has this time been for you? So I'm going to put up the poll. And the question I've asked in the poll is, to what extent... There, the poll's starting there. To what extent is the following statement true for you? Is there a silver lining to our current business environment? So the first option of the poll is that, yes, this is absolutely true for me. I get this. I have changed. I have adapted. I can see the positives. Obviously, we have good and bad days, but generally, I sense that there's a change and a positive outcome. And I'm already applying new skills, and I'm already working in a new way. The second option is that it's somewhat true for me. And I see potential ways of working that have changed, but I'm just not quite sure what this means for me, or what should I do, what shouldn't I do? There's so many opinions going on out there. The third option is that this is not really true for me. I've not seen the opportunities open up. The world's just in a big dilemma of crisis and chaos and disorder. And the last one is that this is definitely not true. I can't actually see any silver lining. And I can't see much changing for me. So whether I'm back in the business, and whenever I do perhaps go back to my role or to my leadership scope, I'm not sure that anything new would have changed. So thank you. I see the polls coming in as we're speaking. So great. At the moment, 66% of absolutely true for me. Things have been changing. I do see the positives, and I can adapt my skills. Some people say somewhat true. 1 or 2, 4, 6% of not really true for me. Lovely. Thank you. So thank you so much for all of your input there in the polls. It just gives me an indication as to the sense of where you are as an audience, and certainly leaning into that, the positives, and already applying some skills. And my hope is that I can just enhance that, or possibly remind you of some things you already know. And how is that applicable now in this state that we find ourselves in? For those that it's somewhat true for you, I hope I can perhaps give you some additional ideas and perspectives to think about, reflect on, and maybe take away and practice. And for those that it's not really true for you, perhaps give you some hope and some understanding, and also some possibilities of some new skills. So I'm going to end the poll now. Thank you everybody for that, and continue with the slideshow. So in looking at this leadership in crisis, I thought it was quite interesting just to unpack and pause on this word crisis for a moment. And if we reframe this word crisis, looking at the original Greek definition of crisis, and the word that originates from ancient Greek, it means a decision or a decisive moment. So we find ourselves in a leadership crisis. What are the decisions or the decisive moments that we have as leaders that we perhaps need to pause and reflect? What are those next best decisions that we need to be making? So rather than seeing a crisis as a negative and overwhelming event, see it as a decision-making moment and reframe that for our own mindset. The other definition comes from medical Latin terminology, where it was a turning point moment in a patient's disease. So at this point, the patient's going to either get healthy or get worse. And it was at that cusp that the word crises came into being. So my question for you is, what decisive moments have there been for you? If you reflect back over the last few months that we've been in lockdown, and this crisis began at the beginning of March here in South Africa, but even before worldwide, what have been decisive moments for you? And what have you learned about yourself within that? And how can you, just honor yourself and take some credit as to where things have worked well for you in that time and in that moment of crises? These are some ideas because we know that leaders are called upon to do all of these things. And many of you may recognize where you know that you feel responsible and accountable and you take this seriously. To really bolster your own resilience and well-being so that you can be strong and clear and decisive in moments where other people are relying on you. That you need to be adaptive, you need to also be able to manage complexity, to look at new ideas, to reshape what are existing and tried and tested business models that had to shift and change, and we had to react in those moments. So what is my personal action plan? Do I have purpose? Do I have vision? Why would anybody want to follow me or be led by me? Is often questions that leaders ask, and possibly that's something that you can reflect on in this time. What is it that people need from me as a leader? How do I maintain the cohesion and the connectivity of people and teams and stakeholders and clients in this new virtual world and this new world of isolation? What does that mean? Where is too much? Where am I too pushy? Where am I holding back? Where have people sort of been lost in the ether? What's happening in that space? So how do I make sense of my context, and certainly that empathy, understanding, and knowing who our people are and how they're coping, and how do we support them? So knowing that you are called upon to do all these things, I've captured 3 different perspectives that I'd like to share with you now in terms of how you can respond with coherence. And I also chose that word coherence very deliberately. Perhaps explaining coherence is easily understood by explaining or giving you the example of incoherence. So as leaders, our chance at the moment is to bring coherence to those that we lead. Incoherence, the best example I can think of is somebody that's intoxicated or drunk or had just too many, where you're having a conversation with this individual and the words just aren't coming out straight and there's no coherence of thought. The ideas flow, they lose their words, possibly even stumble over words. So that's the incoherence. What we're looking at here is the opposite. How do we give guidance and coherence and certainty in the midst of this ambiguity and uncertainty? So the first perspective I offer you is re-looking at your own leadership identity. The second one is using complexity theory to aid us in this decision-making in the crises. And the third perspective is insights from neuroscience, which is an incredible line of science that we rely on a lot in the psychological world, in clinical psychology, as well as in leadership world. So what is that back-end understanding and studies that are going on in neuroscience that can enable us? So the first perspective of reworking our leadership identity is there's a new normal. We may never go back to what we knew as normal. One of my clients that I work with is the Standard Bank. So I do work quite a lot in the financial institutions as well. And Isabel Lawrence, in a workshop recently, who is the Chief Compliance Officer for Standard Bank, framed it so beautifully to say deeply held narratives of what it means to lead have now been challenged. So those narratives could be, what does it mean to be professional? What does it mean to be timeless? When should and what are the right working hours? When should people work or not work? Is virtual, working from home was a bit of a unknown and a bit of a risky business in the past. And now we've been forced and kind of catapulted into this virtual world of working from home. How do we reframe that? How do we trust people that they are delivering and performing in the home environment where we're not physically with them? We can't check their work all the time. Or otherwise, we've got 50% of the workforce on and 50% of the workforce off. Where is that coherence of getting things flowing in the way that they used to? So how am I showing up in this new world? Am I anxious about it? Am I being adaptable enough? What impact am I having in terms of shifting this new identity and understanding what boundaries and safety mean for me? Richard mentioned that I've done quite a lot of work with AfriSam, and the tool that I used with them is something called the Enneagram, and I thought to share with all of you around the Enneagram and how this can bring us and almost reframe the way that we can see things as leaders. We are all different and we all have different patterns of behavior, and the Enneagram is the most incredible tool to look at our personal development in what we call an open systems way. So there's no one right way is what I mean to say. And the Enneagram doesn't box people. We all have our own unique system of patterns. And for those of you that have done the Enneagram with me, I invite you just to re-look at this new leadership identity through that lens. For those of you that haven't done the Enneagram, there's still wisdom in looking at all the different perspectives. How can we see this crisis from different perspectives? And there's no one right way, as I said. So this slide is all these 9 perspectives of this thing called the Enneagram wheel. And how do we respond with coherence? The natural style of the Enneagram 1, so for those of you that know this, you'll recognize this. 1s notice what's broken, and they focus on who or what is responsible and who or what can take responsibility. So really critical in this time for us to identify with understanding what's broken, what's changed, and how can we move forward with responsibility. Type 2s, and the wisdom of the type 2 is to notice the people side of things. What is the impact? Where are we in survival instinct as human beings? And what's that positive outlook that we can reframe as leaders for people? In your types 3, immediately look at the priorities. What's the next best thing? What should we tackle first? How do we get practical and pragmatic with this approach? Really wisdom in that approach. The 4s notice the impact, the feelings, that deeper meaning, lots of questioning. Why is this so? Parallels with other dilemmas in the world, or past historical events that have led to global crises and war. Type 5s need to pause. It's that part of us that sometimes needs to just step back, view things from almost the balcony view, evaluate before taking action, and get perspective. Type 6s give us the wisdom of noticing what's unstable, what scaffolds have fallen down around us. Can we just rebuild them the way that they were? Possibly not. The groundwork's not solid enough. But what's that scanning for danger? What are we missing out? What are the alternatives? What can we recommend? Type 7s set the scene fully. They really are able to see that big picture, look at that futuristic, enthusiastic view. And through troubleshooting and moving fast and moving with passion, making some quick decisions is easy for the 7. Sometimes you need that in this leadership realm. Type 8s see what needs to be done. They are action-orientated, take control, let's make this happen, let's coordinate, direct. We need that sometimes as leaders. There's wisdom in that as well. Type 9s, they notice all the different groupings, how people are so uniquely responding. We're all dealing with COVID-19, but we all are responding and reacting in a different way. We're dealing with different dynamics at home, at work, with relationships, families, finances. We're all dealing differently, and that's the type 9 wisdom that can bring to us. With AfriSam, it's been amazing. So AfriSam as a culture, and the work that I've done with AfriSam, and this is the case study piece that Richard spoke about, was AfriSam is very much in what we call a one-type culture. So where we're aligning the leadership realm, the AfriSam way, the culture, the efficiencies of working within the AfriSam environment and what aligns to the strategy, it's come out quite a lot in terms of what we call the type 1 culture, which is around efficiency, process, getting things right, no mistakes, high quality environment, and aiming for that. And it comes with its absolute strengths, and it also comes with those weaknesses. Our weaknesses overplayed can sometimes trip us up. So what I worked with AfriSam in the case study is, what does that look like for you? And how, as different in-tech teams, you could work with all the aspects of the personalities around the Enneagram in your team, as well as understanding this culture of AfriSam that is absolutely about efficiency. So the message here is, where we overextend, where we overuse our strengths, they become our weaknesses. And that's sometimes not always the best. So yeah, things can get a little bit ugly without awareness, without us pausing to think and understand where we're at. So I'll close off with that identity perspective and yeah, just a reflection of what is my identity? What am I identifying with as a leader right now would be the question. Moving on to perspective 2, and this is, I mentioned that I work quite a lot with complexity theorists, and it's been quite amazing because they've been around for a long time, and one of them is the sense-making tool of making sense in the world. And it's been quite interesting because some of them have that attitude, you know, we told you so, we could see this coming, and actually we're quite well prepared for it. So it's been really interesting, and I think there's some lovely learnings to share with you from complexity theory. The one that for me stands out and that I work with a lot is called the Carnethian framework that was developed by a man called Dave Snowden. And his company is called Cognitive Edge. Really interesting if anybody wants to Google or YouTube him. Particularly cognitively complex human being himself. And he came up with this theory and framework that was originally intended to assist leaders in making clear decisions and understanding the complexities of their world. And this is his framework. In this bottom right-hand corner, we've got issues and strategies and plans and dilemmas that we deal with as leaders that are pretty simple and obvious. We've been there before. We could see it coming. It's run-of-the-mill. We need to have proper process plans and yeah, understand all of the obvious. And yet we can categorize it quite easily. It's predetermined. And a lot of our world can live in that. So the question is here, what parts of your world are still obvious? In the midst of the ambiguity and the uncertainty, can we try and find those nuggets, especially for the people that we're leading, the things that have not changed? Can we focus on the things that have not changed to bring some certainty in this world of ambiguity? And that would be the learning of this complexity model and the obvious quadrant or domain, as they call it. The second one, if we go up one level to the top right-hand corner, is the complicated domain. And I'd say that leaders, most leaders and businesses live in this space, that things we can predict that it's coming, we can sense that it's coming, but we still need to analyze. We still need to apply our knowledge. Things are complicated. They're not simple and easy to work through. Like following a recipe. The complicated is a little bit needs a little bit of innovation, perhaps a little bit of creativity, but it's quite easy to respond to, and we can make those decisions and decide what to do next. And most of our lives as leaders have been spent in that quadrant, is what I said before. We head into this age of complexity, the fourth industrial revolution that I spoke about. So the distinction between complicated and complex is that complicated is more ordered. There's some predictability. There's some sense that we can make. On the complex side, it was more around the unknown, going into the realm of how does this work? We've never tried this before. How do we change our IT systems to now save into the cloud rather than on hard drives would be a type of example. We needed to experiment. There needed to be failures and successes, and things weren't as predictable. And how we needed to respond was sometimes we needed to amplify and sometimes we needed to dampen. There wasn't one right answer in the complex world. We find ourselves with COVID-19 in the chaotic world. It's absolutely the unknown. Experiments is all that there is. We need to just probe and try and make sense of things and find the patterns that work for us. The ultimate, and some of you may have felt this on certain days, is there's a complete disorder, which is the center of the model. Complete disorder where there is no understanding of no possibility of decisions. So how do we bring things back into the chaotic and then into the complex where we can find patterns? So these would be the tips that I'd leave with you from the complexity theory. The first is to embrace what we do know. Highlight those things that are certain for people. Find the things that haven't changed, as I've said before. Acknowledge that there is panic and fear. Do not deny the patterns and the feelings. And as leaders, try and normalize it. It's normal for us to all feel unsure and uncertain and emotional and, yeah, overwhelmed and really fearful of the future. It's also about reinforcing and repeating messages, giving people safety and security. We might feel that we may be going on about the same thing, and depending on your audience, it's just that repetition that can be so helpful in guiding. The second tip is definitely focus on immediate next steps. In that complex and chaotic world of the Carnefian framework, it's what is my next best step? When I'm feeling overwhelmed and there's too much to do and too many unknowns, how can I latch on to that small next best step and articulate that very clearly for the people that I'm leading? And also the sense-making things. Often sense-making, we don't often have the time when we are in a chaotic world and disaster striking that we have this lengthy collaboration. We can act decisively on those smaller next best steps. The other opportunity, and this also came out in the Harvard Business Review that I spoke to right at the start of this presentation, was around the opportunity that we can seize. And from your poll, I see that many of you, in fact, it stopped at 52% of you, are seeing that there is the silver lining. There is opportunity for us to step out of ourselves, to reinvent, to, no matter what age, to look at new things. And many of us have been forced into that. And we can feel proud to have excelled. How can I use that? How can I use that to help others? And what does that mean for employment going forward? For me, for my staff, for my business, and for the clientele that I lead. So those are the tips from complexity theory. The third perspective I offer is from neuroscience. And the reality from a neuroscience perspective is that we as the human race are under threat with this virus, and we respond in survival mode. I'm sure all of you have heard of the fight, flight responses that are typical in terms of the survival mode. The reality is that we have different environments in our brain and neuroplasticity that I'll speak to as well, where our primitive brain, or the amygdala, actually takes over, and what we call it hijacks our higher order brain, or our brains that make sense of things and that are more analytical and cognitive and reality checking. So when that happens and we're in the survival mode, it's like we've been attacked as humans, and there's this back end of, comes out in subtle ways. You know, we've had to now wear masks. Why are we wearing masks? We're under attack. There are those simple things that often give us these perhaps even unconscious signals that there's danger out there. Best I wear my mask. And that brings higher anxiety. It brings exhaustion. Also, it seeps our emotional energy. And that sense of inconsistency. Where am I safe? Where am I not safe? What is this world bringing? I've posted up an incredible, insightful quote from he's actually a psychiatrist, and he works with INSEAD University. If any of you have heard of that, as one of the famous business schools, INSEAD. And this quote was just absolutely incredible for me. I do have to put my glasses on, I'm sorry, to read it out for you. So it was his response to the incredible exhaustion that our bodies are feeling. And it is, if I just read it out, I spoke to an old therapist friend today, and I finally understood why everyone's so exhausted after the video calls. It's the plausible deniability of each other's absence. So our minds are tricked into the idea of being together when our bodies feel that we're not. So the dissonance of that is exhausting. It's easier being in each other's presence or each other's absence, one or the other, than in the constant presence of each other's absence. Making sense of that kind of triggers our brains. Our bodies process so much context, so much information in encounters that meeting on video is being a weird kind of blindfolded. We sent too little and can't imagine enough. That single deprivation requires a lot of conscious effort. So I think we forget how many other signals when we're in the presence of people, when we are communicating with clients, when we're out there in the field, when we're getting the job done. We read body language, we understand people's moods, we start seeing patterns of behavior that as leaders we just naturally respond to. And in the consciousness of our isolation and absence, those readings, that other forms of intelligence of being present and being able to lead and enable people is lost. So what does that mean for us? The good news is that from neuroscience perspective, there is something called neuroplasticity. And this is our brain's ability to reconstruct and to respond to our environment and how the environment has changed. So there's a short rule that I've quoted there, Hibb's rule. Neurons that fire together wire together. Neurons that fire apart wire apart. So the learning here is to say, how do we keep these patterns of thinking in a consistent way? How do we challenge ourselves with new patterns of thinking so that we can wire our neurons together in this new way of thinking, a new way of working? What should we be practicing? It is around us practicing. So children are completely neuroplastic. As adults, I think it gets a lot not as easy, and we have to deliberately and consciously practice these things and wire our brains into new ways of thinking. So what does this mean for us? Our brains naturally seek pleasure and avoid pain. That is the normal state of human consciousness, and we almost move along this continuum throughout our days sometimes and throughout our world. So we have a natural ability to seek the pleasure, and through your poll I can see as well is that this is absolutely true for you, to see the silver lining and to look at the good side and look at the positives and move forward. So as leaders, how can we really enable and operationalize this and make it work for us? We need to be very conscious of our default mode. What is our default mode? What is the normal pattern that we normally went into in terms of our routines and our process, our communication, our way of working, our own patterns? And how do we look at the different inputs and experiences that are there now? We need to check our perceptions of whether that is true for us or true for our people. We essentially have the primitive brain, which we spoke about, the amygdala, which is living in that survival mode. We definitely have emotional elements of our brain. And we have the rational brain, that cognitive sense-making application of the brain. So where we allow the habits and the default mode that are in survival primitive mode, coupled with the emotional brain, we then focus on the threats and what could go wrong and what is this threat that's following us. The option of that is to focus on the possibilities and to really seek the pleasure. And that is a link in between the rational brain and the emotional brain, and to look at both. So how do we do this? We be aware of our triggers. What pushes my button? What triggers me? What really makes that primitive brain and that emotional brain fire? And the more aware I am of that, the more I can control it and catch myself in the moment, that I'm not triggered and that I can think through things, give perspectives, be rational, be calm. I can find ways to ground myself. And with that, I particularly use mindfulness practices. So where can I be mindful? Where can I just be conscious of my breath? Where can I do something like a mind sweep and just get everything off my shoulders, externalize my thinking, put it on paper so that I can then think and reflect and prioritize and think of what's the next best step. And we can use the hero concept. So just sit back and having conversations and connecting with people about what is hope? Where do we find hope in the situation? Efficacy, what are the most efficient decisions that we can make? What is pragmatic? What's practical? What can we do? What hasn't changed? Those things that I mentioned earlier. Where do we have resilience? Where have we coped with situations like this before? What have we done when we've coped before? Would be the R of the hero. And where is the optimism? What does the future hold? And where can we do things differently? So using that simple hero concept as a topic of conversation and checking in with yourself on how you feel like that. So what's in the foreground? Certainly resilience. And the recovery from COVID-19 creates a focus on human capacity. So how are we building one another up? What does that mean? And how do we really, really appreciate and show appreciation for the people that are working so hard and keeping things running in the absence of our normal. I've shared a quote there. This is a marathon and not a sprint. We cannot sprint. We need to find that resilience, keep that coping mechanism. So I mentioned that I worked with Standard Bank, and Sim Shabalala, the CEO of Standard Bank, sent out an acronym that has really gone viral within that organization of PACE. How do we pace ourselves as leaders? How do we make sure that we are in this marathon and not overworking, not burn out, knowing that obviously the banks are in financial services? Other organizations, Google, for instance, asked all employees to take a day off on May the 22nd to address work from home related burnout. And it was an absolute must that everybody took a day off. It's interesting. So the DDI in the United States and Canada, they do an international global annual survey actually with top organizations around leadership and challenges. And they started their survey just before the lockdown. And well, actually it was beginning of March. And so some survey data had come in, and now they're continuing the survey. And I think it runs till the end of June now. And in the survey, one of the things that came through was that people are not actually taking voluntary annual leave in this COVID-19. So where are we switching off and actually taking that normal time out of leave? It's like our leave and our home and our work have all just merged into one. So yeah, the stats of taking annual leave for those organizations that have continued working has dropped dramatically. Really interesting. On the bottom left there is the whole inclusion of compassion, of that people component, the empathy side of things. On the top right is the increased communication and connection and leaders really reaching out. So that's a client of mine, MTN, where they had been sending this weekly comms to individuals to really stay connected and reinforce, motivate, and send messages. And the bottom right is a lot of organizations have been doing huge statistics to stats. So that's the forum that did surveys on leaders as to how many hours am I spending in front of this computer per day. So just things that are giving us information and ideas that other leaders are doing in other organizations. So my ending note is really to emphasize that resilience is key. How are you looking after yourself? How are you taking time out to reflect, to cope, to understand that resilience is both a mental and an emotional strength that you have and that you have within you. And unless you pay attention to it and really look at your identity, understand the complexity, understand how you're responding, making decisions at this time, and understanding some of those triggers that we have and that we are finding ourselves in survival mode, and what does that mean from a neuroscience perspective, and how that all assists us in terms of coping. So this is a definition of psychological resilience, which is the ability to mentally or emotionally cope with a crisis, which is what we're in, or to return to pre-crisis status quickly. So how are we continuously cycling with this resilience that we have as leaders and find ourselves and remind ourselves that we have it? So I end with this question. If I knew that I had been through the worst, how would I move forward? How would I move forward today? If you knew that you have been through the worst, how would you move forward today? What would your next big steps be, your next practices that you would take on? And I end with that thought. So, Richard, thank you. I have not checked the chat line at all, and I know that you said that you were going to be holding that piece on the sidelines. So I'd be really interested to know if there's any questions or anything that would be worthwhile responding to.
Yes, thanks for a great presentation, Karen. We have got a few questions, but before we get into the questions, I've had people say to me, when you're at work, people can see that you're there. So there isn't this guilt. But when you're at home, people don't know whether you're actually being productive. So this guilt of having to find that you need to work harder because people don't see you, so they don't know what you're doing. So you almost have this guilt that forces you to work hard because you need to show your value. Because at the office, you don't have that need to show value because people just assume because you're there, you're working. So you have these people who have this appearance fee. They arrive and they expect to be paid. But you have people who are output driven. So maybe let's start off by commenting on that first, and then we'll get into some of the questions. Because a lot of people have expressed that they find that they're working a lot harder, they're a lot more productive at home than at the office. And my sense is it has a lot to do with the fact that people feel the sense of guilt. I have to prove that whilst I'm at home, I'm not just sitting in my pajamas in front of the TV and waiting for a phone call or answering an email. I actually am working, and I have to prove that.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Richard. So for me, that would fit into that first perspective of needing to almost reconnect with our identity. So how do I identify with my value system? How do I quantify whether I am performing? What's that almost invisible system, or like you said, what used to be a visible system of me knowing whether I'm adding value? And I'm needing to recalibrate that and almost realign with where I feel that I add value, where I feel I perform. How do I align with expectations of the business in terms of delivering? And for me, it's part of it is a self re-evaluation, and part of it is having really honest, I would say, expectation exchange conversations with your teams and others that you are delivering for. So what are the expectations? When I am doing X, how is that perceived? How is that picked up? How will you know in terms of me reporting in, providing, whatever data, spreadsheets? How are we re-evaluating that performance? And so I do think that there's a guilt factor. And how do I need to reorganize? The reality is many people have needed to reorganize, to have homeschooling, to reorganize their days. We don't have the privilege of getting into the vehicle, leaving things and going into work. There's a whole different dynamic at play. So where am I still offering the quality and the hours, but maybe not in the normal 8 to 5 business that I possibly did? For me, it's about having those honest conversations. Oh, I can't hear you, Richard.
Sorry, I was muted there for a while. I see a lot of people responding saying that is so true. They feel very stressful about working from home because of this guilt element. But let's go to the first question here. And it is a question from a colleague of mine, Shane Moodley. He says, what role does upward leadership play during a time of crisis, and how important is it?
Okay, upward leadership. So I'm understanding that, interpreting that to be me managing upwardly in terms of hierarchy status. Yeah. So I suppose that's possibly an influence, and again, it's by acknowledging that no matter where you fit in terms of a traditional hierarchy or status in an organization, we are all going through dilemmas and anxiety and changes. So how do we offer a perspective or ideas, or it would be, for me, perhaps even offering next big steps from where I see it, offering it upwards as well. So we all see the world in terms of the view and the plane at which we operate. And often people higher up in organizations are not always as in touch with the coalface, or as in touch with what are the dilemmas that we are facing and the decisions that we may needing to make on whatever level we sit at. So by offering those next big steps, by offering forward and upward, clear indications on what are the challenges and what are the possible solutions, it would really enable that upward leadership to be able to see the full perspective on all the layers down, and what are the challenges that people are facing no matter where you find yourself in the business. Yeah.
The next question is from Famida Campbell, also a colleague who works at AfriSam. She says, the biggest question I have is that the workforce is actually seemingly more productive not being in the office. What factors would drive such energy, and when in the office under these strange times? So she's basically saying, why does it seem as though people are more productive when they're working from home than when they're at the office? So I think we've touched on it earlier on, but maybe just a few more thoughts.
So I think that for me, perhaps people have, like we said, we are absolutely adaptable, and the coming to terms with what we've had to cope with, using our resilience to make things work at home and change things. I think that also being on the stress of going into work, fighting traffic, dealing with stress factors that have been in the typical work environment before COVID-19, really, I suppose a lot of that, we've had the luxury now of just being back and having the pleasure and reappreciating the home environments that we have and what that means for us. So, I think that the dilemma that I'd like to add there is that certainly in my clients, there are many, many people that are loving working from home, that have found a renewed sense of self in terms of working from home. And the dilemma comes now is when we come out of this lockdown scenario. How do we readapt to now not working from home? Because it feels to me that there may be a sense of loss and having to now adapt to go back to those typical patterns is going to be another adaptation that we actually need to prepare our workforce for. What does this mean? Is this going to be staggered? What are the essential services that need to be in the office? Who can still work from home? What does this also mean with property and rentals and all the practical sides of things? I mean, businesses own huge, huge office buildings. How do we deal with all of those dilemmas so that the complexity is way from over in terms of leadership consideration? Yeah,
and I was watching an interview on CNN the other day where they had someone who's also in your field of expertise doing sort of executive coaching, and sort of trying to predict future trends, saying that, in future, imagine having to conduct an interview virtually like this and having to tell people that you have the ability to work from home, you have connectivity, you have got fiber, you've got all of these things. And think about, so that type of conversation is perhaps easier in the developed world, but think about where we find ourselves in a developing economy where the vast majority of people do not have the privilege of being able to engage like this. We've got the challenge of Eskom and load shedding. Thankfully, we in this lockdown period with reduced economic activity, we've also had reduced energy consumption. But think about the economy peaking and Eskom having load shedding, and then this sort of thing becomes impossible because you just don't know when you're going to have load shedding. So we've got very different challenges in the developing economy, which perhaps does not quite put us in a position of countries like the USA, Germany, the UK, where this new normal of working from home is in fact being explored in a big way, whereas in South Africa, we might have to think a little bit differently about how we do it. But anyway, the next question is from Rudolf Rickert. He says, in terms of the Enneagram, you stated that we, and I assume it's an AfriSam a colleague of mine, he says, you stated that we fall under the type 1 category. Is this where leading organizations find themselves? Or do you need to have a combination and a spread of different Enneagram types and styles?
Great. So absolutely a spread is the ideal. And yet when we talk about overarching cultures or almost aggregates of the Enneagram, so where do cultures lean into? What is the norm of business? How do things work around here? And no matter where any individuals find themselves on the Enneagram, there is, in most businesses, there is a leaning towards the way things are done around here, the culture, what's important, what's made our business successful. So at AfriSam, it's that one type culture that has led to success. It's that efficiency, the structure, the process, the quality, the making sure. And also the high responsibility of individuals within the sense. So that's to be regarded, and I know it's high. I mean, AfriSam is proudly AfriSam way in terms of how you do things and what that's meant for business. So I suppose the difference is in terms of the distinction of culture versus the leadership diversity around. So, I mean, we know that diversity brings enrichment in any sense. So the Enneagram diversity of leaders that might all be performing within the AfriSam culture, but they bring different strengths, different motivations, different almost core thinking ways into that environment. And that brings the richness, not necessarily the culture. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Karen. We have an interesting question here from Utwalang. I don't know if it's a he or a she, but the question is, will the work-life balance phrase be a thing of the past with the new normal? That's a very interesting question.
Wow, very interesting, very interesting. So, yeah, I'm not too sure of the phrase. I once read an article, it was from the United States, and I remember it was balance, like work-life balance is bunk, was the question. And absolutely, it's actually not possible. There's no such thing as work-life balance. It's around me self-managing. So where am I coping? Where am I putting my energies? Where am I aligning the expectations in a real way? And I suppose it also goes to us reinventing who we are in this space. What does it mean? How do I set boundaries for myself where I need to? How do I stop working when I need to pay attention to other things? Because when I'm sitting in the same environment and I'm working and it's home and it's exercise and it's routine and it's everything, where do I have boundaries would for me be a more balance. So it's boundary balancing rather than work-life balance, perhaps.
Yeah. I see we've got quite a lot of engagement going on, which is good to see. So I see Gavin Jolian says, what impact does this way of working have on the performance management process and systems of evaluating performance? I assume it's an HR-related question, and a challenge facing most leaders in this time is how do you go around managing efficiency and performance, especially I think for organizations that are not output driven or output focused, but more focused on time that people put in, etc.
Sure. That is a huge challenge, and I'm not sure that people, certainly the clients that I deal with, are all looking at reinventing what that looks like. And how do you manage that? So some industries, like you say, I'm not sure that all of South Africa is in that, but they do almost have monitors in terms of your IT system. So they know when you're online. The organization from a domain perspective can monitor those things, but whether that is producing any quality or I'm just happen to be online. So, for me, it's absolutely I suppose trust comes into it in a big way. How am I trusting the individuals that work for me? How do I grow that trust? How do I make sure that that the output that they are driving, that I can trust them to do what they say that they're going to do? So as a leader, the emphasis would be on building trust from a performance management perspective.
Yeah, and I suppose that speaks to the next question, which is also a very good question for leaders. Rudolph says, the discussion is focused on persons who work from home, but he says on the operational side, there are many people who have been placed in unfamiliar work patterns. What advice might you give a leader or a manager to help cope with these emotions that arise?
Absolutely, absolutely. So the one is that there seems to be a new sort of emergent, what we would call like an insider-outsider dynamic. So part of us are on duty, part of us are not on duty. So whereas before we were one workforce and possibly all, in a pattern and in a routine that was secure and valid and understood, now those things have shifted. So the advice would be, how do we find those things that have not changed? How do we lean into the complexity theories of what can I focus on? Be very clear on the next best steps. Be very clear on the equality of dividing up the work and why we're operationalizing in the way that we are. And just being alive to those emotions, to try and normalize them, that everybody's worlds have shifted in some ways, and how do people respond and react differently to that? So it would be that what has not changed, if we can try and amplify those things, what is still clear, what has stayed the same, what is still safe, and yet understanding and normalizing the dynamics, and possibly, how people feel a bit polarized perhaps, or a bit insecure in this new routine.
Yeah. Karen, thanks. This has been very, very insightful, I think very valuable, especially for leaders. A lot of advice for leaders in terms of how they manage and build trust. I think the big learning for all of us in this current environment is how you build trust. How do you make sure that the people who are having to deliver certain outputs are doing it in a way that's comfortable for them and yet meets the organization's objectives? Doesn't matter how they do it. Doesn't matter whether they choose to work until midnight or not, those sorts of things. It's changing the way we think about how we manage our people, how we manage output. And I think a lot of the conversations have been about working remotely. I mean, some people have expressed concern, they want to go outside and have a bit of a smoke and chat with their colleagues, and they seem to be missing that, because at home you can sort of sit at your desk and just smoke as you want. You don't have to actually walk outside and take these breaks. So I see a lot of interesting questions, and I'll speak to our communications team and see how we can post some of these on the website so that people can see some of the conversations. But I just want to take the opportunity to thank you for your time and for sharing your insights. It's been hugely valuable. We started these webinar series by focusing on the economy, because at the time everyone was concerned around lockdown. What does it mean? What is the impact? What's likely to happen with organizations? So we had Dr. Azar Jameen, and then we had a focus on the construction industry. And today we're zooming into personal health, emotional health, leadership strengths. So our next webinar, we're going to zoom into personal finance. And we will have with us in 2 weeks' time, Maya Fisher-French. She's an award-winning financial journalist and a presenter of the popular Money Matters on ENCA. And I know I watch Maya quite often on ENCA, and I get my kids to watch her because she offers very good financial advice. So Maya will be our next presenter. She has recently published her money guide, Money Questions Answered. We will have a special gift on the day. Thanks to Maya and her team, they've made 100 ebooks available We still need to decide the criteria of who gets to get these 100 books. So my suggestion or my advice to you is, as soon as you get the link and as soon as you receive the invite for the next webinar, try and log in as quickly as possible, because you might be one of the lucky ones to get Maya's ebook. And we look forward to our engagement with Maya Fisher-French in 2 weeks' time around personal finance. A lot of people have had to take unpaid leave. They've had to take salary cuts. Some people have faced retrenchments and job losses. A lot of families are experiencing great financial difficulty at this point in time. If you have questions up front that you would like us to forward on to Maya so that she can deal specifically with concerns or questions you might have, please send them to us so that we can pass these on. So Maya's presentation will focus specifically on the questions you might have. But let me once again thank Karen. We will continue to engage with Karen as we have done for years now. And if we need to invite Karen back, we will do so. We've got these webinars set up for an extended period of time now. We know that as people start returning to work, you know, what we've seen is in lockdown level 5, when everybody was stuck at home, lots of people were dialed in, and we understand that people are sort of going back to work and not everybody can dial in. But we will be doing these every second week. We will be doing these webinars. So thank you all for dialing in. Appreciate the time. Stay well, stay safe, and all of the very best, and see you in 2 weeks' time. And thanks, Karen. Thank you very much for your time. Take care.